So good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us for this important topic today on religious and spiritual trauma. We're very happy to be joined by Teresa Mateus, who is an educator, an author, a clinician, a yoga teacher, healer, many other hats that she wears. I'm very happy that we were able to bring her to NAMI Greater Cleveland virtually to present on this topic. I will allow Teresa to introduce herself more fully in a few moments. But before we begin, just a few notes about netiquette or online etiquette. Please do remain muted throughout the presentation so we can limit background noise. Please also utilize the chat feature if you have questions. We will be answering questions on the fly while Teresa is presenting. So I will be monitoring the chat for that purpose. So we will pause if you're asking a question that's relevant to what Teresa is currently presenting on, as well as providing time at the end for Q&A. This webinar is scheduled for 90 minutes, so we should be concluding by 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. I will also be putting a link to a survey in the chat at the conclusion of the presentation. We appreciate if you would give us your honest feedback in that short anonymous survey. And again, this is being recorded, so this will be posted to the NAMI Greater Cleveland YouTube channel later in the week, and I will also be sharing the slides from the presentation with you in a follow-up email after the webinar. Many of you are likely familiar with NAMI Greater Cleveland. I'll just say a few words about our organization so you're aware of our services. NAMI Greater Cleveland, we are the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I see there's a question about CEU. So unfortunately, NAMI Greater Cleveland is not able to offer CEUs for this presentation. So thanks for asking that. So I could say that at the beginning. We are a part of a national grassroots movement at NAMI dedicated to improving quality of life for individuals with mental illness and their family members. And we do that by providing education, support, information, and referral and advocacy. So please be aware that you can always refer a mental health consumer or a family member to NAMI for a support group or for an educational program, or you can always refer them to our helpline, which can connect them to local resources and services related to mental health and community well-being in the greater Cleveland area. So with that being said, I will hand it over to Teresa to begin her presentation. And thank you all for joining us. Happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'll start off the slideshow. I'm not a big fan of staying in slideshow mode the whole time because then it feels like we're all just staring at a PowerPoint. So if you want to share in the chat, I'll do a brief introduction to me and kind of what got me into this work and to talking about this topic. But if you want to share in the chat while I'm doing that, either what brought you here, what you're interested in learning about today, what you're hoping to hear about, you could just write in the chat so I get an idea of who's showing up and why you're all here, why you want to take your lunchtime and have this conversation, which hopefully it is a conversation. You know, digitally, oftentimes we can feel like disambiguated heads, right? But hopefully this becomes a conversation. I'm going to share some elements that I've learned and explored along the way around this topic, but hopefully also you can either share things that come up for you or insights that you have or things that resonate or questions you have along the way. We'll be able to go through questions as we go. If something I say hits on something and you want some clarification or you have a question, feel free to post that in the chat and Matt will bring that forward. So I'm glad to be here. I'm joining you from northern New Jersey, where I just moved back to after almost 20 years of not being here, a circuitous route via South Florida, Asheville, North Carolina, Chicago, Louisville, Kentucky, and now back in Jersey. So my accent, I can tell, it slowly is creeping its way back in as well. The longer that I've been here, it's only been a handful of months. But also, I would say, circuitous way that I found myself talking about spiritual and religious trauma. It was not a thing I sought out. It was sort of a thing that found me. So I was trained originally as a trauma therapist in clinical social work at New York University, back when I was originally living here. And I was very interested early on in integrative methods for healing. So mind-body connection, mind-body-spirit connection. And so I brought a lot of that into the work that I did, became trained as a yoga teacher, became a meditation teacher, really integrated the sort of interaction of all the parts of ourselves into the way that we heal and into the way that I understood trauma. And so as a result of having that kind of broad scope of the way that I was doing work and these sort of specific dimensions of it that connected to spirituality, connected to meditation in a broad way, I started to get invited to spiritual and religious communities to offer meditation, to offer somatic practices, to offer different things. And oftentimes some of that, the conversations I would have or the topics that I would discuss while I was there, also while sharing practices, was trauma. What is trauma? What does it look like? That kind of thing. And so as I was going around, this is often places around the country where I get invited to go from different spiritual and faith spaces. As I talked about trauma, people would start to come up to me at the end of talks and say, you know, you just described trauma or PTSD as these things. And when you said that, I resonated with it. Those things I've experienced, but I've experienced them in my spiritual religious community, and nobody's ever talked about that as being a trauma or being something that could give you PTSD. Is it possible that these things you described could be what's happening to me in these places? And as people started telling me their stories and explaining them, one, I realized, yes, absolutely, what they were describing were traumatic experiences. And two, there were very specific elements and sort of patterns that I noticed. Every kind of trauma I've treated: combat trauma, domestic violence, sexual assault, social justice trauma, varieties of trauma that I've specialized in over the years. And everyone has kind of their own fingerprint or DNA of what they look like, different patterns that are specific to that kind of trauma in that community. And so as people were telling me their stories, not only was I realizing, wow, this trauma is not just present, but it's pretty abundant, unfortunately, and in different kinds of spiritual communities, right? It wasn't exclusive to one particular tradition or spiritual lineage. And also it had kind of markers or things that were elements that kept showing up that were specific to this kind of trauma. And so sort of my brain is a little bit social scientist as much as it is therapist. So as I started listening to it, I started to kind of build out these categories of, oh, this experience has these patterns, and there's ways in which it impacts people, and there's ways in which it impacts how they can deal with the world or how they heal from it is also very specific and unique. And then I thought, well, nobody's really talking about this or writing about it, you know? So I started collecting these stories as sort of case studies of what this experience was like in different spaces and places. A lot of the source material and stories that I heard originally were in sort of Christian or fundamentalist Christian experiences and landscape, but it also spanned to yoga traditions, to Muslim spaces, to Jewish spaces. I mean, I heard the stories, Buddhist spaces, and then some that weren't necessarily within like a particular spiritual tradition, but might be teaching particular spiritual practices or something like that, that sort of fell outside of a tradition. So I started collecting these stories, and then the stories and the information sort of built itself out into a book. So the name I put on the header for this talk is Sacred Wounds. That's also the name of my book. Which really brought together and discussed a lot of these things. Now, luckily, I think I put a resource list at the end of these slides, but yeah, okay, thanks for reminding me that. Though there are more resources out there now than there were when I wrote my book. I want to say it was like 2012, and there was no book that I knew of out there at the time. There might have been one other. Now there are more books, there are more articles, there's more people talking about it, there's more groups. And, you know, like Matt found me, I've also found that folks still find me, you know, about this conversation, right? People are hungry to have the conversation and maybe are resonating in some way with the experience. So whether it's an experience you've had, and you know, I say there's like lowercase trauma and uppercase trauma, like, right, there's experiences we can have that are traumatic, and they may not create post-traumatic stress disorder, but they may hurt, they may impact how we relate to the world. And when it comes to spiritual and religious trauma, may impact the way that we have difficulty trusting, right, the spiritual landscape or religious spaces. And then there are sometimes really big, huge things that happen within spiritual and religious contexts, which can include really specific kinds of abuses, some of which we hear right in the national landscape and on the news and that kind of thing. So my study of it has included that whole spectrum, right? And all of it is valuable, and all of it is valid experience. So whether you're here because you're just interested, as I'm looking, I really appreciate everyone kind of sharing where they're coming from, like from folks that are maybe working in faith or spiritual spaces that I've definitely done a lot of work where folks are like, we want to make this space not traumatic. How do we do that, right? Or people are like, I've been hurt in those places. Some of this content topic is relevant to me personally, maybe some extreme experiences, maybe because you're just interested in understanding what this is. I see all across the spectrum, right? Folks coming in. So I'm glad to hear all of your voices, bring all of your experience into this, as I said, what I hope is conversation. And as we go into this, as somebody who's trauma therapist, at the base of what I do before anything else, I want to just say that when we talk about these things, whether this specific version of topic of trauma is an experience you've had, it can hit on things for us, right? It can resonate with things that maybe are hurt places inside of ourselves. And so as we go through this workshop time together, and even after throughout your day and your week, I just offer the invitation to be gentle with yourself, to listen to yourself, to pause if you need to take breaths if you need to do whatever you need to be as comfortable as you can in this space. And also know sometimes things can linger afterwards. And so just creating that space to be gentle, what I call gentle and generous with yourself, through our time together and beyond it. And as well, an invitation to ground yourself, however you might need that, whenever you might need it. We're going to go the flow of today. We're going to talk a little bit about PTSD trauma. What is that at the baseline? Some of the ways I talk about it are sort of shorthands that I've created over time to talk about traumas. So they may not be specifically the ways you've heard about it before, but kind of talking about the landscape. Then honing in on spiritual and religious trauma, specific elements and impacts, biopsychosocial, spiritual, to a human being that experiences this kind of trauma. Then some just kind of sharing some examples, right? And this will be time if you have something that you've either noticed, whether it's in the news or something that you've seen in your own community, whether it be like the landscape of the communities you live in or an actual community you've experienced. You can also feel free to share things that might be relevant. And then getting into how we heal, right? It is, like I said, everything is kind of a fingerprint. We're each unique. We each have unique fingerprints to how we experience trauma and how we heal from trauma. And also each kind of area of trauma has unique elements. And so we'll talk about some of the unique elements that are specific to spiritual trauma, both in the impact and then later in the healing process. And then I always like to, as I say, being gentle and generous with yourself also means being grounded. And so as somebody who is also a meditation facilitator and practitioner, I like to just open any space I facilitate with a shared practice. So I just like us to take a few moments before we get into the content of things to just settle wherever you are, settle in your seat, settle in your body. Allow your body to relax into your chair. You could turn camera off if you like, if that's more comfortable for you. Allow your body to settle into the chair. If you can, and it's accessible, you can put your feet on the floor so you can actually feel yourself grounding beneath you. And if it's comfortable for you, you can gently close your eyes. If it's not comfortable to close your eyes, just find something in front of you or below you to look at that's static, that isn't going to change, so that you don't feel the distractions from outside. And bring your attention inward. And as you do that, begin to pay attention to the rhythm and the pace of your own breathing. Just without changing anything at first, notice the length of your inhales, the length of your exhales. Noticing the rhythm and the pace of breath as it moves in and out of your lungs. And then as you bring that attention inward, slowly begin to expand that breath. So on every inhale, imagine you filling your lungs up with air like a balloon, expanding through your belly, through your ribs, through your chest, feeling it pressing outward, filling with oxygen. And on your exhale, you can slowly release that breath out, letting the exhale be a little longer than the inhale until you feel yourself wringing out all that air from your lungs, maybe feeling your belly pull in towards your spine, if that's comfortable, and letting go, letting go, letting go. Taking another big, deep inhalation in, filling your lungs up with air like a balloon through your belly and your ribs and your chest, all the way up to your throat. And then when you're ready, you can exhale, slowly releasing that oxygen out. Full and deep inhale in, filling the belly, ribs, and chest with air. And exhale, releasing and letting go, letting go, letting go. And then finding a slow and steady rhythm of breath, one that's comfortable and particular to you. Settling in your body, settling in your mind, knowing that sensations will come in our body, but we can release them and let them go just for this moment. Knowing that thoughts can buzz in our mind, always looking for attention, but in this moment, releasing our focus on any one thought, any one feeling associated with a thought, and just allowing ourselves to relax that focus, relax our attention, letting go, letting go, letting go. Moving in that slow and steady rhythm of breath, particular to you. Knowing that breath, slow and steady, is a resource always accessible, that you can always return to whenever you need it. Relaxing your mind, relaxing your body, even just in this moment. Letting go, letting go, letting go. Knowing that you can always return to this breath throughout the time that we share together, throughout your day, throughout your week, whenever you might need it. It's always there for you, always present in our body. An essential part of life, but one we don't pay attention to often enough. And then as you're ready, slowly and gently bring some energy back into the muscles of your body, maybe wiggling your fingers and your toes, maybe shaking your head gently from side to side if it's comfortable for you. And then if your eyes are closed, you can gently begin to flutter them open, bring your attention back into this shared space, this shared virtual room. All right, thank you, everyone. And again, thank you for joining to reflect on this topic. I see a lot of folks that are chaplains and mental health care providers, some really interesting points of reflection, folks that are coming to this from probation officer in corrections. I think that's a really interesting point of intersection, thinking about both how does spirituality overlap when folks are incarcerated and post-incarceration, as well as unhealthy spirituality that can come in with folks, right, or unhealthy experiences, and then maybe how that can shift. And we'll get more as well into when we talk about how people can take spirituality go. I will say though, it has brought up a recent story. I was meeting with a post-incarceration program in Harlem. A program I run now is also based out of Harlem, called Exodus Transition. And it was really lovely because I met somebody who's Christian contemplative. I met somebody else who is Buddhist. Almost all the staff are folks that have also previously been incarcerated. And to a person, each one that shared their spirituality with me also shared that it was the thing that saved them when they were inside. You know, that many of them found a healthy spirituality when they were inside. And they said, even in this space that I was completely locked up, I found my liberation. I found my freedom. So I share that as well, because like a lot of what we're going to talk about is the harm that can happen when unhealthy spirituality is carried out by flawed humans, right? But also healthy spirituality can be such a resource. And so I think the balance, and that's what makes this this issue so complex, because the place of harm is also ultimately such a profound place of healing, right? And so it can be very hard for people to find that resource of healing when it's been the place of harm. But there is, for those that choose to find a spiritual path again, there's potential to do that, right? But it's a matter of how do we get there? And then there are folks that choose not to, and that's also equally a viable route. You know, it's what everybody chooses. And that's the freedom of healing and recovery from anything, is that it's choice, right? That we all get to choose our path. And that really, when we're traumatized and abused, we don't have choice, and the return of choice is ultimate entry point to a kind of liberation. That's very important, and especially important for this kind of trauma. So I'm going to share my screen again as we move into some of the slides that have a little bit more content. So I want to talk a little bit about, like I said, an overview of trauma. Many of you here are care providers, and so some of the baseline of what that is familiar to you, but I'm going to share some of this sort of lexicon of the way that I look at trauma. So I always talk to folks about the idea that our brain is like a card catalog, and our memories and our experiences are stored away in that card catalog. Now, again, I also realize that card catalog is an old-fashioned term, and so contemporarily I've had to use cloud storage system as the other example, right? So whatever generation of that speaks to you, our brain is a place, a repository that holds memory. And when the memories are benign, they can be pretty flat, you know, like a piece of paper, like a story you remember. Sometimes maybe little pieces of that might be vivid, like you remember how the grass smelled when you were running across it as a child. You remember how something tastes. You know, our senses are very, they often bring our memory more alive, but for the most part, they're fairly compact, right? They come down into a very small file in our mind. Trauma, unfortunately, because it's such an abrupt and visceral and painful experience, often never kind of condenses down to become that flat piece of information in our brain. And as a result, it takes up too much space, right? And particularly, you know, in many cases, when we have trauma in our developmental life, so meaning in our childhood, things that are multiple experiences, say family trauma and spiritual trauma, I'll explain in a minute, is a bit like family trauma, because it can often happen over a long period of time and can often happen through the developmental periods of someone's life where they're learning and living in community, and those traumas can build up. Similar to a childhood or a family trauma. And so the more there are, the more space that trauma is taking up, each individual trauma taking up too much space in the brain, until it's no wonder that it becomes the prominent pieces of information that our brain are constantly going back to, right? That's why when people are triggered by a traumatic experience, what pops up, it's not that happy memory of running across the grass, it's the terrible thing, because it takes up so much space. It sort of pops to the surface so easily, so much more easily than those flat, condensed, sort of packed away files in our mind. And I think also what's important to recognize about trauma, and this has been important for me was important for me, particularly early on, as I thought about trauma as not just a talking, thinking experience, right? Like, so our historic experience of how we treated trauma was often, or treated anything, right? Early psychotherapy was you sit down and you talk about things, right? You talk about the experience. And as we learned more and more about trauma and more around the nature of our body and our brain and how those things function together around trauma, we learned that actually talking, speech, story is not always the best first access point to try to look at trauma, express trauma, because the area of our brain called Broca's area that experiences that affects our speech is an area that is triggered when our trauma is triggered. So when that 3D memory comes out and unfolds in our mind, Broca's area is impacted and often frozen, disconnected, so that the very thing that allows us to input information, when you talk to me, I input the information through that Broca's area, and export information by processing it through my brain and then telling you what I need to tell you, is shut down. And so for so many years, we tried to treat trauma through the very entry point that was blocked. Which is why I think it's important when we understand how trauma is experienced to understand how embodied it is, how visceral it is, and how often it shuts down the thinking part of our brain, and that reptilian part of our brain, which many of you I'm sure know is the one that's primarily activated, and that one doesn't work so well in the thinking, talking landscape. It works very much more in the sort of creative landscape, the embodied landscape. And so often where the sites of where we experience the trauma so viscerally, when it floods out, when we are triggered, when we experience something that reminds us of that trauma and that 3D memory explodes outward, overloads most of our brain functioning at the sort of cognitive level. And our body is sort of left there experiencing it and not knowing what to do with it, which is also why somatic treatments, embodied treatments, like finding ways to regulate our body and regulate our stress, has become so important over time. And this understanding that breath is so important, a reason why I always do breath practice when I do anything. And if I meet with any client, I always do breathing practices. Is I say, one, it's simple, it's easy. I can teach you to do that simple breath, breathing through your belly, ribs, and chest in the very first time you meet me. And it's something you can leave and go out with into the world that's very tangible, but it's also very visceral. It's speaking to the part that is triggered in stress, and it's responding in a way that part can understand, learning how to breathe in a regulated way. When we experience stress and we have that fight, flight, freeze, or submit response, our body does what an animal would do, say if it was hunted in the forest. The deer in the forest gets alert, and then its pulse and its heart races, its breath speeds up, so it's getting ready to run, or it will just freeze there. Its breath will freeze and it will hold still and hope that the predator doesn't see it. And we do the same thing when our stress response is triggered. And oftentimes that'll happen on small scales. We don't even realize that it's happening just throughout our day with smaller stresses, those lowercase traumas or those lowercase stresses. But when it happens in those big ways, I've found that the breath is the first place that notices the stressor, the first place that responds, and one of the first sites that we can easily create a remedy. So thinking about, when we think about stress, when we think about trauma, not just as a brain response or a memory response, but it's a whole of person, a whole of body, mind, body, spirit response. And so it requires that kind of view when we think about how we're going to remedy or try to resolve it. And then also just as a reminder, not all trauma becomes PTSD. The common example is if 10 people in a room experience a traumatic experience, 8 of them will leave that room and have experienced the trauma but not have PTSD, and 2 of them will come out and have more extreme symptoms or responses. So it's about 2 out of 10, about 20% out of 100% of people will experience PTSD, and often that's in relationship to past lived experiences, past traumas, the level and extent of resilience that each individual person has, which may be relative to past traumas, but may also just be personality. There are people I've met along the way that they just have a lower threshold for resilience. And that's just sometimes an inborn thing. Some people's threshold is higher, some people's threshold is lower. Oftentimes people I've learned, that have had decades of trauma had actually great resilience. It was just they had too many traumas. which is why I think of resiliency oftentimes as like a rubber band. It's something that you kind of stretch and stretch and stretch, and it will bounce back, the first 5-10 times you do that. But if you stretch a rubber band, if you do it all day, or you do it week after week, you do it month after month, that rubber band will stretch to a point where it no longer has the bounce back. It no longer has that resiliency. And so that's often what I see with longer term and consistent trauma, is the resiliency gets stretched out. Now, the beauty is, unlike a rubber band, both our brain responses and our resiliency responses can reshape itself, right? We can actually tone those things back up by learning new ways of responding to stress, responding to traumatic experience from the past and present. But it has to be a learned process, right? Otherwise, people are going around without any resiliency. So even the smallest thing then that happens is something that they can't handle, or may crumble them. They may fall apart under. So it has to be sort of relearned again. And then I like to think about trauma as a sort of chain of events. So sort of like 6 degrees of separation, I call it 6 degrees of traumatization. And this again, and we'll get into it more specifically when we talk about spiritual and religious trauma, which often are longstanding periods of trauma and stress that folks are under, is the triggers build up exponentially because the traumatic experiences have built up so exponentially. So one of the examples that I give is like, it can be sound, sights, sense, or sensations. But when I used to work with combat veterans, right, the source point for an example of combat trauma was burn pits in Iraq. It was a place where things burned. It wasn't even necessarily that bad things were burning there, but the smell was such a specific smell. And it reminded them of the place where things were bombed, where their friends died, right? So the scent of a burn pit was a thing that reminded them of stress. And then they come home and they think, it's fine. There are no burn pits here. I'm going to be okay. And then they go out to the park and they go to meet their friends. It's a homecoming welcome event, and there's a barbecue. And they all of a sudden start to have a panic attack, and they don't realize why they're having a panic attack. And while they smell the barbecue, they're also hearing kids in the background making noise. And now the barbecue is reminding them of burn pits, and the burn pits are then connected to the sound of kids, reminded them of the kids right before that IED hit that killed their friends. So it's like something that feels so far away from the actual source of the trauma can end up being something that triggers somebody. And now, because they hear the kids and they smell the barbecue, they don't want to go to a park anymore, right? And so they go, oh, well, I'll go to a club and I'll meet my friends. But they go to the club and the club is crowded and there are too many people. And it reminds them of the market where they had to go through on the convoy. And when they went through the market, something bad happened. So they go, oh, I'm not going to go to the bar anymore. I'm going to stay in my house and I'm going to play video games. Oftentimes it was Call of Duty, which is a silly game to play. I always told them, if you went to war and you're traumatized, but it's the one they always played. So they sit at home and they'd re-trigger themselves with the shades down, and they wouldn't let anybody in because their friends were the ones that were there when they were at the barbecue, when they were at the club. And so those friends are now reminding them of the place they were triggered, even though the friends have nothing to do with the original trauma, which was the burn pits or the market or the kids crying in Iraq. And so now they've sort of cloistered themselves in a tiny, tiny universe to try to avoid all the things that relate to that trigger. And so each new sort of degree of separation that may seem like nothing to anybody else. Why won't my friend come to the door? I'm just their friend. I'm not something that's a problem for them, is related to them in this weird connection that their brain has created to this original trigger, which might have just been burn pits in Iraq, right? And this is true for any kind of traumatic experience. And so this is also why people, when they start to experience overwhelming triggers after they've had multiple kinds of traumatic events, often over many years, their world gets very small. And so part of the rebuilding is, how do we help people build back, learn that those things that they associated with the stress are not the triggering thing themselves, are not the dangerous thing themselves, and build back a world outside of that. All right, so spiritual and religious trauma in specific. Again, like I said, there are specific things that I noticed when I began to look in spiritual and religious trauma. And one was, at the core, it is a very existential trauma, right? So, and what I mean by that is the source of belief, right? The thing that gave my world meaning, which was whatever it is, my spiritual faith traditions, values, the belief system, in Abrahamic traditions, a God figure, all those things that I looked to define how I believed about the world, what I believed was right and wrong, how I lived day to day, and often, particularly in communities that were even more insular, how I did everything, right? How I dressed, what I was allowed to say and not say, what I was allowed to believe and not believe, down to the tiniest thing, was guided by this place that caused me harm, right? And so how do you, one, separate yourself from the place that gave you all meaning and all purpose and all value? That's almost a seemingly impossible task, which is why I think it's so brave when people actually are able to extract themselves from unhealthy landscapes, from spiritual and religious trauma, because it is not getting rid of one thing, right? Or even one person or one abuser. It's an entire process and system of indoctrination and of responses to the world and of meaning making, right? Because not every single thing in every single moment inside of a place or a situation or experience that was traumatic, even when it was abusive, was bad, right? There were people you loved. There was a belief system you loved in some element, some form, that kept you there as long as it did. It was a value set that told you what everything meant and what you were supposed to do. And often it was the core relationships that people had from their very childhood onward. Often when the communities were very insular, it was everybody you knew, right? So it's learning that a system that gave you everything is not right in what it built for you, right? And it's a needing to let go of that. And then how do you find meaning again? Whether it's spirituality or religion, just meaning as a person, right? We all require a kind of system of meaning making, a system of moral values. And so that's why this also intersects with a concept called moral injury. If it's not something you've heard of, you can look it up further. I also have some resources at the close that give some more details about that. But moral injury essentially is an injury to that moral space, that moral center, that moral grounding. Now, it can be in a spiritual and religious context, but it also can just be in contexts that go against the moral meaning making, say you were given, that was a healthy one. So I'll give the example of war again. Moral meaning making throughout somebody's life through a system of spiritual beliefs or faiths. All of them have some version of like, do no harm to another, don't kill anyone, right? Give kindness even when somebody gives you pain and suffering. And then folks are sent to war where they're given a different set of values that go completely against the set of values that they were given before. And oftentimes they have to abide by those set of values, kill or be killed, literally to stay alive, to persevere. And then they return back to a universe that says, well, this is a place we don't kill. This is a place we don't do harm to others. This is a place where those values come back. And so it's very jarring, right? How do you go from the meaning you were given to a different set of meaning where you had to do things that now go against the meaning you've returned to? And in the case of spiritual and religious trauma, it is often the moral center that you were given that you realize is the thing that did the moral injury, right? So the place that told you what everything meant actually told you things that were harmful, maybe harmful to you, maybe harmful to other people. And so that's an injury actually to your moral understanding. So it's a kind of existential and moral injury that, as I say, is very specific when it's in spiritual and religious context, that is different than even the moral injury that would have been experienced by the person that maybe went to war, because maybe they went to war and were given a different set of experiences, but they come back to what potentially is a healthy moral meaning system. Folks that grow up in a system that gives them an unhealthy moral system don't have anything else to go to, right? So it's actually a really, it can destroy essentially everything about who you are, the world as you knew it. And I describe it, I don't know if folks have seen the movie The Village. It's one of the M. Night Shyamalan movies. But if you have not, you can read the summary. I'm going to spoiler it just because it's been like out for 25 years. So if you haven't seen it, this is your spoiler alert. You can mute me if you don't want to know. But the movie The Village, it starts out in this sort of what looks like a sort of colonial, very simple village. People are wearing sort of colonial dress, old-fashioned dress, living in this small village surrounded by this forest, and they're told there are these horrible monsters. If they go outside of the radius of the village and the short surrounding area where they go and harvest things, they go outside those parameters, terrible things will happen. They will disappear, they will die. There are terrible monsters out there. And so 90% of the film, you're in this kind of horror movie where you think, oh my God, there's something terrible out there. And if somebody goes missing, oh my God, the terrible, horrible creatures have killed them. And at the very end of the film, somebody goes far enough outside of the village, outside of the perimeter that they were told never to leave, and they come across a contemporary highway. And you realize the whole time these people have been living in a village inside a universe that was not the whole reality. It was a small reality that they were told and given. And actually, there's a whole other contemporary world once you go past that border, right? And to me, the reason I use that story is because it's a perfect example of spiritual and religious trauma. People are often kept in insular communities where they are told this is the whole world and everything else out there is evil. If you leave this universe, if you leave this way of understanding, of believing, and even this community, oftentimes, like wherever all of your friends are, everybody you've always known, you will be killed. Terrible things will happen. The devil will get you, right? And so often people go out into that world, and when they breach that boundary, it's terrifying, even if they understand at an intellectual level that what they were told was not correct and the world isn't actually all terrible and all horrifying and full of demons. There's still that inborn fear that's built of all those years of being indoctrinated with that kind of information. And so I also describe it as a kind of domestic violence, family abuse system, because often these systems of spiritual community that are most unhealthy are most insular. And so like a kind of abusive household, if a child is kept in a household and kind of told you can't have any friends, don't tell anybody about what happens at home when you go to school, is a very similar experience. Sometimes literally the same kind of thing. They will say you don't talk about what happens inside the community when you go to school, if they even let them go to public schools, depending on how insular the experience is. And it's this abusive family system where often either a God figure or whatever is the sort of macro level of that spiritual tradition is told to you is the one that's bringing down all this. The reason you have to believe this way, the reason you have to be this way, the reason why women have to often, in many of these kind of insular communities, people that are kind of in the more margins of the community are even more marginalized. The reason why women only have such and such role, the reason why gender minorities are bad, the reason why sexual, being anything but straight is bad, is all part of this unhealthy moral system that tells people if you fall outside of what the community says is right, you are bad, you are inherently evil. And it is told to you as spiritual principle, right? Not only I'm not telling you this, right? Like the leader of a community will say, I'm not telling you this. This is what the Dharma says. This is what the Bible says. This is what God says. This is what our spiritual tradition says. There's a higher being or a higher sense of principles that you're told is the reason why all these things are true. Now, it may be a distortion of those principles and those ideas and those mentalities. But if you grow up in that, you believe it's not the leader of the community, it's God, it's the deity, it's the belief system that thinks I have to do this. So you actually ultimately really feel like you're being abused by what I say is an abusive God figure, right? Abusive deity figure. So ultimately, like the abusive father is God, even though that's not true, right? That's the mythology that was created by humans. But you ultimately feel terrible. You feel like if you fall outside of that, you are a disappointment to the universe, right? Not just one human being, even in one family system, but an entire universe, right? That tells you that you are not okay if you believe different, if you are different, right, than what the community says is okay. And then often these communities are hierarchical and very strictly hierarchical, right? There is one or a handful of people that hold the power. Often in most communities, I would not say all, but many and most, even across spiritual traditions, those are mostly straight men. So there's a kind of gender and sexual hierarchy as well that falls down from that. And, the more constricted a community is, the more limited power and control is to a very limited set of people, it's also why it's such a ripe landscape for other abuses, right? Because if only what these people say are right, if we never tell anybody what happens outside of the community, what an unfortunately perfect, I say perfect in a terrible way, what an unfortunately perfect condition in which to harm people in increasing ways, right? Sexual harm, physical abuse, whether it's in the family that you exist in, the actual family, because then you're not going to leave the community to go and tell other people, right? Or it's by leadership within the community or elders in the community or what have you. And this is why, a lot of people use the Catholic Church as the prime example, but I'll be honest, within, unfortunately, every community I've come across that is the most stringent in these kind of hierarchies, inevitably there is physical and sexual abuse happening in those communities. So that may be the one that's lifted up, but it's not exclusive, right? And it's a function of the way these systems build themselves so that they are insulated and protected from any kind of negative outcome, any kind of legal outcome, and it makes their ability to get away with so much more horrific. And unfortunately, so many of the stories that I heard along the way as I started to listen to people's stories and the case studies that end up in the book, inevitably, all of these elements that create a system of harm often led to this person also being sexually violated, physically violated in some way. And so those are not, it's not automatic, right? But it creates the environment in which those things are often able to happen so easily for so long and without repercussions. And again, as I said before, it makes it very, very hard to create not only meaning outside of that community if somebody's able to leave, which takes so much strength. It's so hard. And which is why I say, it takes a lot of bravery to leave. It often takes a long time to leave. I met along the way, as I met folks when I did my book tour, and then beyond that, I would meet folks that had come to communities that had become refuges, kind of from those communities. Sometimes they would be led by folks who had also left those communities, and then they would build their own sort of like exodus communities or fled communities, right? And what I learned is there's often, like in many of these, especially ones that are larger communities, mega churches, large cults, there would be essentially like underground railroads where people would be reaching into folks that wanted to leave but weren't ready yet. Again, similar to domestic violence, often people, many times women, but not exclusively, often folks that were queer, trans, anything that didn't conform, their money would be held by other people. They may be in a marriage that they didn't have access to any of the resources, any of the power or control of their finances, maybe weren't even able to have any job or anything like that, or their job was tied to the community, which is often also a way to keep people inside. And so there would be a kind of underground railroad and a slow process of exiting people, trying to help them get, scavenge away some money, some resources, a game plan of how they were going to safely leave without something terrible happening to them. So leaving alone is hard enough. And then when you're out in the world, you may be out there without skills, right? Without having gotten education that the outside world understands as having value, without understanding basic things. I often would talk about folks having like a second adolescence when they left these communities, because often both your identity, your sexuality, who you are as a human being is so stunted in many of these communities that people would come out and they would be like, I don't know what color I like. I don't know what clothes I like to wear. I don't know what my hobbies might be. I don't know what kind of sexuality I have, or even I wouldn't even know how to express that. I was never even really taught any kind of sex education. And sometimes what I've seen when that goes off the rails, particularly I saw this very often in post-evangelical communities, folks that left evangelicalism, which was very rigid around sexuality, purity culture. People would get married very young, have kids very young, and then they would leave, whether with or without their partner, from that community. And then there would be this kind of like sexual revolution, right? Or like no inhibition, they could be 25, 35, 45, and they would be like, I'm going to drink all the alcohol. I would have sex with everyone. You know what I mean? Like it was this kind of thing that you would, that puberty would do to you at 14, but like your parents and social structures would wrangle it in, but nobody's wrangling in at 30, 40, 50, right? So oftentimes people wouldn't even know how to regulate things that we would think, oh, this person should know that because they're X age, but they actually don't because they never ever learned that. So there's also a whole human development process that actually has to happen oftentimes after people leave this community, which is one of the things I started to teach communities on. I was like, I think there's some stuff here you don't even see is happening, right? Within the community, within this exit, right? Like the post-exit experience from some of these. And then also this kind of conditional love that is created by these communities that's also told to you is the conditional love of your belief system, the conditional love of God, whatever it is, creates a kind of unhealthy relationship to love, right? An unhealthy understanding of relationships to others. And so oftentimes I would also see folks that would leave these communities and get themselves in a unhealthy next community. Might be something totally different, but with somebody who had a similar kind of hierarchical leadership style. Might be like even a self-help kind of guru or something, but was unhealthy. That would give them the kind of structure they wanted to get. I would see folks find an unhealthy partner that would replicate the kind of conditioning that they had in that community. And so often not understanding what healthy love is, what unconditional love is, created this kind of conditional love pattern of relationship. Again, very similar to an unhealthy family system or coming out of domestic violence. So this is just a brief diagram. As always, I never have enough time and I want to leave enough time for our questions at the end. So I'm just going to show this. You all will get access to the PowerPoint afterwards, so don't worry about that. This is just a kind of diagram that gives an expression of moral injury and PTSD. If it's moral injury is something you're interested in, particularly if you work in the fields of spirituality, chaplaincy, spiritual health in any way, even if you're a mental health counselor and you engage with spiritual health in that, I would suggest looking into more. There's plenty of great YouTubes, books, that kind of thing out there on it now. It's a really interesting way to kind of come at and understand this kind of harm. And so I went through a couple of these already in terms of some of the kind of ways in which these communities impact a person and how it shows up specifically in this context. The conditional love, the unchecked ultimate power of a few, isolation from the rest of society, the denouncement of anyone that falls outside of a community's norms and rules, or excommunication, kicking out folks out of the community. Seeing those people leave can be very scary, being worried you'd be the next person if you don't think right, act right, be right, whatever that being is that the community says it wants you to be. You can't think for yourself. Independent thinking is looked down upon, may even be one of those things that folks get denounced or kicked out for. A request for money or other resources, including labor, time, and often for free. I think that's a really important marker, is like, I always say, like, it's fine if your spiritual community is like, we'd love if you give, you donate back to the community. But when it's a requirement, or when so much of your time and your resources are asked to be given into the community so that there's nothing else for you to use it on externally or on yourself, or have a kind of cushion, then that's a dangerous sign, which is also why I see even that kind of like, spiritual teachers or gurus, or even self-help kind of gurus that are out there, when they ask for exorbitant amount of money, I always say, look into it, right? Learn all the facts, understand who this person is, what is their training, education, what, because as I said, some of these are distinct spiritual and religious communities, but I've seen it happen with just folks that are just gurus of some kind. They say, I am the self-love teacher for all, and then they want $10,000 to start for the opening course to learn how to love yourself. Something like that can also fall into this kind of culty category. The only truths or right answers come from the top of the hierarchy. So if you want to share in the chat anything else that you've seen or heard or think of, even in things you've just seen in the media, or things that you've seen folks around you experience as other examples of these kind of obvious markers. I will say in my book, not that anybody has to go out there and buy that, but I do have a more extensive kind of list of contextually what I call is like the healthy guru versus the unhealthy guru, kind of looking at there can be healthy spiritual teachers out there. And often in the rebuilding process for folks who are then they're like, well, I don't want to leave spirituality altogether. I want to find something that gives me meaning. Maybe it's not even a spiritual teacher. It's just a community, right? Like I want to find a community that gives me meaning. But I'm so scared that I don't know what's a healthy community, right? So, I try to give folks a lot of examples of these are the things to look out for. Like this is what a healthy community could look like, right? A place where they say, yeah, sure, they can ask if you want to donate to the community, but it's not mandatory for you to participate in the community, right? There may be leadership, but there are checks and balances on that leadership. There are processes in which nobody has ultimate power. Any place that doesn't let you have independent thinking, I think you always have to question whatever that is, right? And why are they doing that? Oh. And then many of you again who are care providers will know about this. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences, and there was a whole series of studies, and now there's extensive studies on this. But I think this is an important reference point just to understand that some of these base levels of trauma, generational trauma and social conditioning trauma, are two that can be very present. They're some of the baselines of the ways in which we can be traumatized early in our life, early childhood experiences that impact that way that we shape and form. And if we think about many people, not everyone, but many people enter into unhealthy spiritual and religious communities before they have any choice, when they're just a kid, right? So their parents decided we belong to this community. They had no choice in it. And so that generational trauma can literally be multi-generations, even within that system, right? So their parents learned how to behave based on being conditioned by the community. And now they're replicating that response to how you behave on the child. And so the multi-generations and layers of conditioning are really embedded. I mean, if we look at Scientology is a great, and I say great example of that. There's multi-generations of families that stay in the system. And it's one of those ones, when you're shunned out, you're out, right? Even if your kids are still in, you're kicked out of the community. And that's so insular. The system of governance is insular. As we saw recently with the Danny Masterson trial, if any of you follow that, he was somebody who got away with sexual predatory behavior for years because the system protected him, because the system had its own hierarchy in which it silenced the women that were being abused, shunned the ones when they went out and reported it, and then essentially kicked them out of the community. So it's like multiple layers of trauma that can happen. Imagine being traumatized by being abused by somebody, then your community telling you, be quiet about it. It's your fault, or it's not a problem, or this is why it happened, or it's because of our belief system. You just have to let it happen, whatever it is. And then when you finally have the courage to say, this happened to me, to a police official, to the external system, you lose everything. You lose your family, you lose your friends, you lose any support system. So it's trauma on trauma. And often, again, like I said, the conditioning of that trauma starts at a very early age. I did give already some examples in context. One additional example I'll give real briefly, because this is kind of interesting. Again, we say that, right, in psychology, interesting about things that are horrifying, are terrible, are predatory. One example I came upon that I talked about in my book that was sort of a backwards religious trauma. Well, I'll explain. So I lived in South Florida for 6 years. South Florida, particularly the Palm Beach County area, is the most densely addiction treatment center, recovery meeting place, halfway house place in the country. It's the most of each of these kind of places. And so it's almost exclusively recovery. I remember when I moved down there, people would go, "Oh, so how long have you been in the program?" And I say, "Oh, I'm not in recovery." And they're like, "What are you doing living in Delray Beach?" So it was so recovery oriented. And most of those people were young. There were often people coming from the Northeast, actually, like Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, places like that. Some from the Midwest, major cities, Chicago, Cleveland, stuff like that. And they would come down to Southeast Florida to get treatment, and they wouldn't want to go back to their addiction environments. They'd be late teens, early 20s was the dominant population of folks. They would just stay down there because it's a huge recovery community, and there's not many places in the country young adults could find that. So it would stay living down there, and then they would build community down there. Now it's a bit of a mixed bag because it means there's also people trying to predate on those communities, some with drug sellers and stuff like that. But one in particular that I found that was a spiritual trauma was there was this guy that was in addiction recovery from heroin who started this yoga studio that became bigger and bigger. And all these young adults I knew that were in recovery went there. And so I started going to a couple of classes, and then I started talking to some of the students. I started to hear some of the things that were happening, and he was becoming this private mentor, usually to young women who are in addiction recovery. He was building this community bigger and bigger, young men and young women coming, but he would focus his attention on these young women, and he would tell them, these yoga principles is what's going to get your recovery. This is how I stayed recovered. Let me teach you. I'll guide you how to stay in recovery through these spiritual principles, through these spiritual tools, and I'll give you special coaching and mentorship and counseling and special yoga sessions, right? Special yoga sessions where he would get more and more physically handsy with them. And I had multiple women tell me about this. So this guy had essentially predated on people based on understanding that they needed some system of accountability and morality and meaning making to keep them in recovery. But he used that system of meaning making as a place to be predatory on people that were highly vulnerable. Equally, there was a really extreme fundamentalist church that built itself up in the same town. And they had very extreme fundamentalist views, very isolative community principles. Get in the community, keep them in the community. But they marketed themselves as being a young adult recovery church. And so they would get these people who came out of 12 steps, which is very regimented on purpose, so you don't die, right? So you use the 12 steps, it's very effective, and it imbues itself with a sort of general spiritual principle. But often people in early recovery would feel, I need something deeper, right? And so they would be seeking out something more. How do I keep these principles up, but lifelong? How do I build a spiritual foundation, but more deep? And so there would be these communities waiting to predate on them. Come on in. We'll give you strong values. We'll give you absolute truths. We'll give you exactly what to do. And they would sort of shape them into these isolative, extreme communities because the people needed this belief system to survive, and they knew they did. So I give those two examples because often they can be places where people are born into, but they're also places that can take advantage of people in vulnerable positions and know how to do that very expertly. So it also can work the other way around. How we heal. So I'll spend a couple minutes on this, and then I want to make sure we have enough time to get into as many questions as possible. So I don't know if folks know Resmaa Menakem. He's amazing. He wrote a wonderful book about people of color healing called My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. And if you're interested in a kind of mind, body, spirit perspective around BIPOC trauma, I would recommend his work hands down. He does some trainings also on racialized trauma, both for white practitioners and people of color practitioners and just general community members. His work's amazing. But this is a quote from his book. Years as a healer and a trauma therapist have taught me that trauma isn't destiny. The body, not the thinking brain, is where we experience most of our pain, pleasure, and joy, and where we process most of what happens to us. It's also where we do most of our healing, including our emotional and psychological healing. And it's where we experience resilience and a sense of flow. So just like that reminder that, while we think it's all in our brain, most of it is encompassing all of our whole selves. As the site of healing. So healing is intersectional, which means all parts of ourselves, right? So like all the parts of us are related to the parts that were hurt, right? Our gender, our sexuality, our social location, our physical ability, all parts of ourselves are access points sometimes of trauma, but also of resiliency, right? More and more we spend a lot of time in the recent years learning and talking about intergenerational trauma, but I also like to think of intergenerational resiliency, right? So we have the resources and capacity to heal, and the memory beyond just our own selves and our own lifetimes, whether it's in our spiritual traditions, whether it's in our ancestral lines, of how to heal. And that is within ourselves, right? Within our DNA, within our brain capacity, our capacity for creativity, our capacity for meaning making, all of that is within us. It's communal and individual. And I think this is true about all trauma, but I also think it's especially important for folks that have experienced spiritual trauma, because community is often a site of pain and suffering, right? And so finding and building healthy community can be such a place of healing and resilience. And helping someone, whether helping yourself or helping someone that you're working with, to find that meaning making, not just as an individual journey, but where do they find communal connection? Because understanding that all community doesn't have to hurt, doesn't have to reject, doesn't have to have conditional love, is a really important part of building back. And again, that doesn't have to be like jump out and find another spiritual community. Oftentimes that's not the best idea for somebody, because they could find another unhealthy community before they learn how to be resilient and how to see what healthy is. But it could be finding a book club, right? It could be finding an art making group or whatever. It could be just finding a place you could be with other people, even if it's at a minimal depth, right, to begin with. I think that's just as important to keep in mind. And that it's embodied, that our sites of our pain is embodied. Again, not just if it's physical or sexual trauma, but that we feel our pain with our whole body, and not to exclude our body when we're thinking of how we recover. And then rewriting our story. There's a whole practice in therapy that's called it originates from practice called dream rescripting, but I like to think of it as just life rescripting. How do we rewrite our story? I was talking to a young woman last night about this, who experienced a lot of developmental childhood trauma, and has spent a lot of her time living back there. She always wants to go back there. Well, this is what happened, and this is what was bad, and this is how this experience happened. And the truth is, when we've been traumatized, particularly at young ages, our memory isn't even necessarily a reliable resource, right? Because we remember things as we were. We remember things through the lens of how traumatized we were at the time. So even in this woman's case, her memory is very distorted. She remembers things that often are impossible to remember, things at such young ages she couldn't possibly have remembered with clarity, but she's remembering it through her trauma. So it doesn't make the feelings untrue, and it doesn't actually make her insights untrue. It just means it's not particularly helpful to keep going back to the stories, because the stories may be unreliable, but the more she tells them to herself, the more they become the whole reality, and the more they take up that three-dimensional space in our mind, right? And what we want to do is condense those memories down and make them flat. Again, because they're an unreliable resource, and our memory from those times of trauma are often an unreliable resource. Doesn't mean the trauma didn't happen. It means there's more information to be garnered from how we feel about it, how we have insight around it, and how we can change it going forward. And that's the rescripting and rewriting our story. Well, who do we want to be? What do we believe in? How do we want our story to be starting now? And what can that look like, regardless of what came before? And then part of that, building on the rewriting our story, is reclaiming. There are parts of ourselves that maybe we never even fully got to let blossom. Learning, starting from a very baseline, right? I said before, somebody going, I don't know what my favorite color is. Reclaiming who we are, right? It could be as simple as, what color do I like? Let me try these 5 shirts on. Oh, I like this green one, and I don't like this purple one. Particularly people that have come from communities that have been so restricted. Oftentimes it can be those simple choices that can feel so liberating, and that we have to help people celebrate. That is amazing that you learned today that you like a green shirt. You know what I mean? Like, it can be such a small thing, but it's such a huge victory, because picking that green shirt is breaking out of maybe decades of conditioning that said you don't even get to pick anything. You don't get to think for yourself. You don't get to have a favorite color. Your opinion means nothing, and you're not even allowed to have an opinion. So that one choice breaks somebody out in that moment, starts to rescript both their brain process, both their feeling and body process, their story, breaks them out of so many different things in that small thing. And so in that way, we start to reclaim who we are, how we can love ourselves, and what we love. Maybe there are even things from our past that we go, I actually really realized I did like ice cream before I was told I couldn't have it. Or this one time at school, I love this chocolate cake that I was never allowed to have at home, whatever it is. And then everything is a choice, right? So when people, and this is true about trauma in general, but especially, again, important when people have been given no choice for so often, so many years, so long of their life. And so much of what they were told is you don't have a choice. Your choice means nothing. Your choice has no value. Everyone needs to have choice and agency. So and that includes healing. And particularly for those of us on this call that are folks that are in the fields of healing, that can feel really hard, right? Because we want people to heal. That's our goal and that's our aim. And sometimes we can push people in a direction and not realize we're pushing them, right? And so if we're providers, it's also about self-reflection. When am I trying to make this person get where I want them to be? Because I know they can get there. When am I pushing and not letting it be their choice, right? For me, it was always trying to figure out how far does this person want to go? What do they want to do right now? And how do I help them get there? How do I give them the agency to decide where we go? And then I just walk alongside them and aid them in getting there. And then maybe once they get there, they decide, hey, I can go a step further. And sometimes they can't. It just depends. Somebody who has 60 years of trauma, it's much harder than 10, right? And so there are folks that I worked with that said, I cannot get past this point. I will not go past this point. And so we just worked on making life as vivid as possible within the threshold of what they were capable of handling. And then oftentimes for other folks, it will be, they'll get to that point and they'll go, I can go a little further. I can go a little further, but it has to be their choice. And so we don't get to choose if other people heal. And if it's for ourselves, we always have to give ourselves agency to have that choice and to have the agency to know that we can say no. I call it the art of the necessary no, which is just learning to say no to something and realizing nothing bad will happen, right? Because in an abusive family, as I said, this is kind of right, abusive family, you could say no and you could get hurt, right? In an abusive spiritual system, you could say no and go to hell, right? Like it's like a mega example of getting hurt. It's a hurt for all eternity, which also, let's be honest, hell is like one of the most abusive ecosystems of understanding of belief anyway. Why would an all loving being create a place where people are tortured for all eternity? It doesn't really make logistical sense if we believe one thing that the other thing would be the counterpoint to that. But that's just my own meandering about theological weirdness. But the ability to say no and know that you won't be harmed in an existential way or in a right now way for doing it is a really empowering thing. Okay, so in closing, before we get the rest of the time, I'm going to give the questions. So I'll just let you all look at this. I already kind of said all these things: learning to find trusting place again, learning to trust yourself, learning to figure out what you want and who you are, trust in yourself and trust in places in the world that can be trusted is the whole thing, but it happens in small steps, right? In small increments. Okay, let's move on to questions. I don't know if I know you had said, Matt, you thought some of the general questions were ones. I don't know if you want to ask me those and then we can flow into questions any other folks may have. I know I also sped through all this, but that's it could be a whole weekend workshop. So hopefully you got a good premise. And like I said, on the slides that you'll get, there's a whole starter resource list, really. You can find many, many more.
Yeah, I think since we have about 15 minutes left, I'd rather leave questions on the floor for anyone to put in the chat. I did also put the link to the evaluation for this presentation in the chat. If everyone would click on that, it's short, anonymous. The demographic questions are optional. If you could complete that for us before we conclude the webinar. Yeah, anyone, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we will answer those. Not seeing any right now, but maybe one that you could address from the questions that I had developed that might be helpful for folks would be that first question of what are your recommendations or thoughts for folks who are recovering from or who are survivors of religious or spiritual trauma, but who still have an interest in connecting with a spiritual path, or maybe even being part of the community or a like-minded community to the one that was the cause of harm? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think, again, as I said, it's baby steps, right? So also I wouldn't want somebody to feel defeated because they tried to go back to another place and they had a panic attack, or they were, scared initially. I've had many people say, I loved going to church, right? And mine was just really harmful, but there are so many things I missed about it. So I tried to go into another church, and I was sitting in the back, being by myself, and then the church bell rang, and I didn't realize that the church bell ringing would trigger me. It was just the sound of a bell that just brought everything up, and I had to leave. And it was heartbreaking for that person because they thought, well, can I never go into a place with a church bell ever again, right? But it's baby steps, right? So that can be as small as building a couple of meaningful relationships with people. It doesn't even have to be around spirituality at first, but finding new people in your life maybe that exist where that were trusted people, that were outside of the unhealthy space that you came out of. Or even folks, like I said, like some of the communities I visited that are made up of people that came out of unhealthy communities and are finding each other. Finding a couple of trusted people that you can start to have conversations with, that you can explore some of those questions. What has meanings for me? What gives value to my life? What do I believe in? Kind of being able to explore those questions. And maybe it isn't a person that you've met yet, but it could be a therapist, could be a chaplain, could be somebody that you meet in the healing profession as well, that you can safely ask questions like, what do I believe in? That can take a very long time just to figure out, because before you decide what spiritual community you're going to go back into, what kind do you want to go to? What kind would you even want to join? What are the things that you take from? Because again, I said not necessarily everything is terrible bad, right? Often there are threads of things that people say, well, that gave meaning to me, or that was still valuable. Or if I took out these unhealthy parts, though, at the core of it, there was something good there. Or, the way in which people supported each other in the community in these ways were really valuable to me. But the part I didn't like was that if I didn't believe what they believed, that I was kicked out, or that they treated me poorly, or whatever it is. So finding the threads of the things that had value to you, being able to lift those up and saying it's okay for me to still care about those, because sometimes people also feel shame and guilt about having things that they like. Do they still love from that place? It's okay to find those things. It's actually important to find those things. And then find what gives meaning in your life now. And so that can be an exploration of the small things. Again, like, what color do I like, to what spiritual principles have meaning to me. And then from that, and building out a couple of trusted relationships, slowly being able to grow that, and finding out, are there communities that align with these things that I believe in? And then it's also okay to dip your toe in slowly, right? So oftentimes for people that might be going to a Buddhist Sangha, or going to a yoga studio, or going to a church and sitting in the back, for the first however long, not saying much, not necessarily, having to be fully invested in the same way. And maybe for some people, it's healthy not to be invested at the same level, right? If you gave your entire life and all your time to the place that you were at last, and that wasn't healthy for you, sometimes people can repeat those patterns and try to get too invested in a place too fast. Sometimes it's good to kind of slow down, find what gives you meaning, find some trusted relationships, find spaces that you can start to dip your toe in. And it's okay to test out, because not every place is trustworthy, even if they're not bad. Not every place is ideal for you, even if they're not bad. So it may take some exploring around and testing different places and seeing what feels more comfortable than otherwise.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think we have time for maybe one more question. We did have a question in the chat, which is what is the best way to address religious trauma that might not have come from a religious place, but from a family member who is extremely religious and abusive and used religion to endorse their abuse?
Mhm. Yeah, and unfortunately that can be just as common, right? Or just in a household where somebody is like a parent or a partner is very religious and use that as a way of restricting or punishing or harming someone else. And I think a piece of that is one, getting care, treatment, help, healing about that trauma and specific in that relationship with that person. And hopefully through that, being able to work through that person is not representative of all spirituality, right? And all belief and all faith and all of that. Being able to separate this person who took these things, and this is true even in a community, right? Even if it's the leader of the hierarchical community, or the person in your family that meted out the justice, the justice to you or the punishment to you, because of what the community said, that those individuals don't represent all belief, and sometimes not even all belief for a whole religious tradition or spiritual lineage, right? It can be that community, that household, that person. And so being able to separate out that as much as you can, right? For some people, they will say, I never want to go near that place again, or those people again, or that religion that person came from, because it's too triggering for me. And that's where the person gets to choose, right? That's their decision. They can choose not to, and they can find a different way to go. But as much as a person can, finding the way to distinguish the difference between an abusive person and even an abusive community and an entire tradition, right? Like those things are not necessarily inextricably linked, and that hopefully with the help of a good provider, that care provider, somebody can be able to work those things out safely. And then I see real quick, just can you provide information on finding a specialist that practices this kind of trauma-informed approach? That is a great question. And unfortunately, there are not a lot, but it's not nobody anymore. Let's say that, right? What I would say is there are a handful of spiritual care providers, chaplains, and mental health therapists around the country that do specialize in this. They are not everywhere. And they are definitely not in every city, every place. So what I would say is finding those folks that do provide this. I would say even Psychology Today now, some folks will literally list that. Or you can put religious trauma therapist or religious trauma chaplain, and you can begin to search if there's anyone even close to you in your nexus that does this work, building out your own resource list. And then if you're a provider, you're trying to refer somebody, it may be someone that they're not necessarily working with on a regular basis as their therapist, but it may be someone that either can provide them some general informational sessions, right? Like, here, I can describe the baseline. Or if it's a therapist or a chaplain, maybe somebody that you ask, can I have a couple of sessions? So that you become more adept as a provider yourself, or you have somebody come in and train your team of folks if you're working with a team, so that, the more we get folks that understand this, the logistics of this, the better. For now, it's still a limited set of folks, but you can research and find the ones that are out there and resource them.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa, for answering those questions. Thank you all for engaging with us today. Just seeing a lot of comments here earlier in the chat, appreciating how informative this was. I did put the link to the survey just one more time in the chat. So please be sure to complete that. Not seeing any more questions so far, just seeing some more gratitude for the presentation. If that's the case, then we can conclude this webinar a little early. Thank you again, Teresa, for educating our NAMI Greater Cleveland community on this topic. I think this has highlighted that it's a topic that needs more attention. So it was great to have you bringing us your expertise and spotlighting this issue. So thanks everyone also who joined us for today and engaged with the topic. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.